Today, I had the great pleasure of being in conversation with Markus Essien. Markus exudes creativity, leadership, and is a student of pedagogy, often described as the act of teaching. Markus has over 20 years of leading and consulting with innovative organizations. He holds a BA in the classics from Howard University and a master's in school leadership from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Markus was the longest serving head of school at the Logan School for Creative Learning. As a consultant, his clients and collaborators have included PBS, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and the World Leadership School. Successful entrepreneurs act as the perfect amalgamation of creativity and business. As CEO, our job is to set a vision for our companies, hire the right people, but as much as anything, it's our ability to create a story or craft a narrative that results in access to larger markets and cheaper capital. You're going to hear more about creativity from Markus in the months and years ahead. So let's get started. Hello, Markus.
Good morning, John.
Well, share with us where you're at today.
I am in Rochester, New York, where we just, my family and I moved in February, my wife and daughter.
Yeah, what prompted the move for you?
My wife just recently took a job as a midwife at the University of Rochester. And so we sort of joked the first 18 years of our marriage, she followed me around, and now we're on the second half. So
Nice. Yeah,
we're here now.
that's great. Where are you from originally?
I would say I was born in St. Petersburg, Florida, but all of 6 months living there. So I would say I'm from Washington, D.C. That's where I spent sort of the early formative years of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And then middle school years, moved to Northern California, where I finished that sort of, where the first 18 years between D.C. and California.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I find so interesting about you is that you studied the classics for your undergraduate work.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that, please.
It's funny, as a storyteller, as an artist, as a creative, as a leader, wanting to be honest. And the honest answer is, it's interesting. I'm the youngest of four, and my older two brothers both took Latin. And so when it was time for me to get to high school and pick a language, I'm like, well, that's what they took. And it seemed erudite and all the things that I thought were cool, I suppose, at that age. And when I got to undergrad, there was that period, like it is in a lot of universities, where you have to pick a major, like,
Yes.
this is the week or this is whatever. And I thought, okay, I'm going to major in English and I'm going to minor in Latin. At that time, I thought, college professor or something like that. And, I'm all of 18 years old, and I walked down the hallway and there's this very long line for the English department. And I thought, well, I'm not standing in that. So I went next door to the classics department and said, hey, I'm thinking about minoring in Latin and, majoring in English, but, so I thought I'd start talking with you. And they said, well, why don't you flip that? Why don't you major in Latin and minor in English? And I said, okay. I didn't spend a lot of time, and they talked about some scholarships that were available. And I don't know, it just seemed like an interesting thing to pursue. And again, maybe a sort of a romantic notion of an 18-year-old just continuing to study classics. And we had, a fairly well-known classicist at Howard University, Dr. Frank Snowden, and his books. And so it just seemed like an opportunity to dig into a community and kind of get in some ways, a really specialized education, because as the only Latin major, I think for almost all of my years there might have been one that came in on my last year.
Yeah.
There are other classics majors and maybe some Latin minors, but I was able to take classes at Howard University, where I was, also at Catholic University, also at Georgetown, and some of my classes were just me and a professor. So it was a really kind of an interesting experience for me, for sure. But yeah, not the most planned version of a major, but certainly one that I feel was fruitful and was instrumental in my beginnings.
And why Howard? Why did you choose?
Yeah, my father, when I was growing up in DC, my father was a adjunct professor at the Howard University School of Divinity,
Okay.
where he taught Christian education and urban ministry. Wow, actually remember that. And so, I had some familiarity with Howard. And so when it came time to look at, undergrad, Howard was one of the schools on my list. And um, I don't know, I think there's some familiarity with DC. I think it was an opportunity for me to be in a historically Black institution, which is not something I had experienced. And so, I took a chance, I suppose, like every 18-year-old, to figure out, you don't know until you get there, but that's yeah, I don't remember too much about how the decision was made, but certainly it was one of the top things on my list. And um, so yeah.
What was next for you then upon graduation?
Well, so interestingly enough, so during my in my freshman year, my father passed. And
Mhm.
so, and my mother had passed, I think 5 years before that, I think when I was 13. And so
Mhm.
there I was, an 18-year-old. I remember telling someone, it's like, there's one thing when you leave the nest, but what happens when the nest leaves you, right? I was sort of was out there,
Yeah.
and had gotten an academic scholarship once I was there. Once you get on the dean's list at that time, you're able to get a free tuition. So I thought, okay, we're definitely staying there. Like we're not going to transfer no matter. And then my oldest brother, had moved back into town, and had taken a job as a math teacher at a small private school. And so in the last couple of years, when I was trying to figure out how to like stay, keep my school going, but I needed to, pay expenses, he said, well, we always need substitute teachers. And so I subbed 1 year, but in my last 2 years, I taught Latin there. So I was a 20-year-old teaching 18-year-olds, but I just kind of got the call, because they needed a Latin teacher like last minute. It was August, and they lost their Latin teacher, and they called me. And so for my last 2 years at Howard, I taught 2 classes of Latin in middle school and high school. And it was great because, they made the schedule work for me. So I think my first year I taught at the school in the morning, and then went to the university in the afternoon, and the second year flip-flopped. And so just kind of followed the education path for a bit, joined DC public schools for a couple of years. And so, put 5 years in, I suppose, from the time I started teaching there, and then kind of decided I was done with education. That's it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of politics and everywhere, but I think the 23-year-old in me was done with whatever politics were going on in education at the time, and um, took a job as a copywriter and copy editor with a company that was called American Writing Corporation. They're not around anymore, but their clients were people like the IMDb and the World Bank and things like that. So
Right.
got to read some of those world reports and try to whip those into shape and all that. Um, and I think, like a lot of young people too, then started bartending. Which is interesting when you think about leadership, like where you learn the things that you learn. And certainly,
Right.
people often talk about doing hospitality as a way of really understanding the customer, right? And
Right.
how do you diffuse situations? How do how can you be artful? How do you certainly, as I moved forward, and ended up being a bar manager and stakeholder in one of the bars in DC, you have to think about a lot. And ours was from the ground up. Ours was from design to launch. And so having
Mhm.
the opportunity to talk to the construction and architecture, get feedback, um, hire a bartender early to help really think about how we build the bar and all the different things, and then be a part of the community as well, right? You're a fixture in the community. How are you showing up? How are you presenting yourself? And um, you know, not that it's celebrity, but you're certainly known in the community, and so it does change how you go to the grocery store. Not that I was a bad influence or something, but certainly when you go to the grocery store, you introduce yourself and you get to know the grocers' names and who's at the deli counter and all that, because you want to be a part of it. And
Right.
obviously knowing the wine cellar down the street and the rest of the um, retail on the block, right? You really get to know everyone.
Right.
Uh, I'm not sure I answered the question, but yeah. So after the teaching, I really moved into a couple different things. So there's the writing, there was the working and running bars, but as I never sort of stopped doing creative, and so I sort of rolled back a little bit. Maybe because my dad was a preacher, I've always loved words, in some ways, I was a reluctant reader. I had, I don't know what it would have been diagnosed as now, but anyway, I had some trouble reading in the early days. But I was creative, and I'd write short stories, and always loved those assignments when I got to create things. And
Right.
while I was in DC and I was running a bar and I was doing some writing, my roommate at the time was a filmmaker, and I would help him on some of his productions, and we made these little. It was sort of the beginning of cable in some ways. It would make these commercials for local restaurants on the cable access, and I had this short story that I thought was pretty good, and I said, hey, hey, why don't why don't you shoot this? I'll turn it into a script, you shoot it. He goes, okay, why don't you turn it into a script and you shoot it? I thought, oh, okay. And so I kind of caught the bug. I really, again, transferable skills. Here you have this opportunity to write and create, and there's the education piece and working with the crew, and just all the things that go into creating a safe environment for people to be their best. And so I did a couple short films while I was still living in DC. This would have been getting near 2000, and then moved to Manhattan right after 2000, when Y2K did not cause the world to end, as people were surmising. But of course, stayed with the bartending, because that was the way I was going to sort of make money and try to land on my feet. But was lucky enough to get connected with a small theater company called Manhattan Theater Source. And it was this really great member-owned, I think it was member-owned, but it was just a great theater where I feel like it was people who came from a couple other different theaters and decided, we're going to do this differently. We're going to do this be more humane. They had some real powerful programs like Estrogenius, which was a women's playwriting festival. And they'd publish a book every year based on these plays that these women wrote every year. And, I got in there and supported what I could, other people's performances and works, but I also got involved and wrote a couple plays for they did this great thing called spontaneous combustion, I think it was called. And it was this thing where the writers and the actors would get together, sort of writer directors would get together on Friday with the actors. Every writer would be given a prompt, like basically every play had to start with the same first line. And then they gave you 2 cultural references. So your play must also reference these 2 people. Mm-hmm. And then Friday night you would write. By Saturday night, it was up on stage. So you had, so these are maximum 3-minute plays. Right. But the gift of no excuses, like, oh, we don't, I want to tweak this. I want to do a little bit more. No, you had to get it up and running. So you had to make it, by Saturday morning, I was working with the actors. You wake up, I said, okay, I've written it. Let's go have coffee and, go to Papaya King and get hot dogs or whatever we could afford at the time. And it was great because I think, again, it forced you to do it. You weren't, writing forever, like, oh, it's not ready yet. Right. One of the pieces of feedback that was really encouraging, I remember in some of my first plays, was, wow, like, Markus, you actually were able to create that art, the dramatic arc in 3 minutes, which, many people know about, sort of that first act, second act, third act, where some of the shorts, they would just end. And you're like, okay, well, it's an unfinished. And so that reflection was really helpful for me to go, oh, you can write those mini arcs in a short period, and apparently you're pretty good at it. So, that experience got me into working with a small chamber opera company where I got to direct a couple operas. One was a New York premiere and one was a world premiere. So these short, very sort of, I wouldn't call them avant-garde, but it wasn't like the Met or anything. We were this small, but it was, again, a great experience. And I think, as it relates to leadership, I think that was one of probably the most pivotal moments in some ways in my leadership. And the why I know it's true, because this is a story I tell often, like when I was in job interviews and different things. Here I am, directing my first opera, and I'm with these opera singers who, I mean, you see opera on stage. These are really impressive people. They can hold the room. Yes. Without any microphone, right? They're just singing.
Yeah.
And they were really insecure. They needed to, asking me questions like, well, wait, should I move over here? And how does this? And I thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea. I thought I was going to be, having to scramble and deal with these huge egos. And um, what again occurred to me was I need to create this environment where they feel safe, where they understand the interpretation of the libretto so that they can sing freely, work with the musical director so that we're in sync, and create this environment where they can just be their best and not have to think about it, right? Just they can just do. And I remember this one soprano in one of the pieces, she had these props, and it was this essentially we'd set up a New York subway as the setting for her opera to take place. And she had, I think we gave her these headphones, and she had this tapestry because it was based on Ariadne's myth. And she's like, the headphones are, I can't quite, and I didn't even let her finish the sentence. I'm like, get rid of them. This is not an opera about headphones, right? This is not, it was a prop that I thought could work.
Mm.
Because everything else works. I said, fine, then let's just get rid of it, right? And so I think in that moment, giving permission, it did a couple of things. Obviously, gave the permission for the artist to speak up. So if she had anything else that she knew was safe to do so. But she also knew that I was prioritizing the final product. I was prioritizing her being successful in singing this opera. And it wasn't about me, well, my artistic vision has headphones in it, and so if you don't get the headphones, you don't get my artistic vision. So I think that was, anyway, that just, I know I spoke a lot and didn't give a little space there, much space there, but that really takes me, I think, into kind of the next phase of what I was doing in my life.
What year is it now?
So this would be 2002 or three. When I'm bad at dates. When did
A couple years have gone by.
Yeah,
Right.
when did the planes hit in September 11th? What year was that? 2000,
2001.
2001. So this would have been right up. Yeah, this would have been 2001 then.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So before we go to the next phase, I just wanted to make a comment that your story is absolutely incredible in that you became an entrepreneur multiple times now, by running multiple bars, and now you're the director and leading groups of people in creative endeavors in the form of plays and operas and so forth. And you didn't go to business school.
No, I did not.
You had no idea that you were going to move in this direction and what skills would be required of you, and yet you figured it out, right?
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and it's funny, the thing that just pops in my mind, I'm like where did I get that from? Like where, I mean, everyone learns from life. We all do.
Right.
I think for me, I was thinking about my first job ever, which was delivering the Washington Post, with my brother in Washington, D.C. And I would have been in, I think, fifth grade, a 10-year-old, and we'd wake up at whatever it was, 5 a.m. and go to the corner, pick up our papers, do our route, and then jump back in bed and try to steal some sleep before school started. And interesting enough, our mom actually had our paper route before us because she took the route for her exercise. She's like, if I'm going to get up and walk anyway, why don't I, deliver a paper? And she was able to actually get the route in our neighborhood. So in retrospect, I don't know how she pulled that off, but what she would do though, when she took us on my brother and I on the routes, when she was giving it over to us, she would walk up no matter how many stairs there were to the house, walk up every stair, put the paper inside the storm door. So we were not slinging, newspapers at doors or on lawns.
From your bicycle.
Yeah, so that the person wasn't waking up in the morning, opening the door and figuring out where's my paper. They would open their door and it would be right there inside the storm door.
Wow.
And so I think, from a fairly early age, the sort of idea of customer service and customer satisfaction and that was, I think, just kind of an early thing, how to do the job. Mm. And so I think that there's a lot that you learn throughout, and in good business is, in some ways, hopefully, is good sense, right? What makes the most sense in the situation? And as a serial entrepreneur yourself, like you have to change, you have to pivot. You can't just stand firm on one ideology if
Right.
that's not working anymore. It's just,
Right.
it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Okay. So you're about to make a transition. What was that and why?
2001, yeah. So I just come back from working on my first feature film as a first assistant director. And so those who are unfamiliar with sort of the crew life in film, um, as it was just, I was talking to a friend the other day, the assistant director does everything but yell cut, right? And typically the assistant director is saying roll camera, making sure the shots are set up and all that, working with the director of photography,
Right.
making sure the actors are where they're supposed to be, calling action and being there to make sure it happens and making sure everything gets shot for the day, all that. So I
Right.
just come back from working on the film, and I was really excited. I just got one of my bartending, my main bartending gig back, and so I'm like, okay, I can eat again. And I was sleeping on a friend's floor. Actually, I didn't have an apartment yet, and I was working a double that day, so I had the lunch shift, all the way through, till dinner. And so I had my clothes on. I was getting ready to walk to the front door of my friend's apartment to leave, and he said, plane hit one of the towers.
Mm,
And I thought that's horrible, and I can't lose my job. Like I gotta go. And
right.
so by the time I was actually walking out the door, he goes, "Oh, second plane hit." I was like,
Wow.
"Okay, something's not right, obviously." So at that point, I was living in Hell's Kitchen, it's typically easier just to walk across Central Park to get to work. I was working on Park Avenue um, at a really nice, a very nice restaurant where I actually also learned a lot about leadership. But by the time I got there, of course, I learned what had happened, and the island, you could see smoke from the bottom of the island, and
Right.
um, it was a mess, and we all had to sort of, dig deep and think about what was important.
Right.
And, you know, even, and then we're, to be fair, we were serving, and this again, 2001, and it's still restaurant's still there, 4-star property, and celebrity chef. And remember just how humbling it was. And I walked by the woman who booked reservations, and I won't quote her exactly for the profanity, but she was the most unflappable person I'd ever met. And
Right.
she was red faced, and she hung up the phone after. She goes, "It's just effing food," and hung up because someone was upset about all the canceled reservations. Like, well, where are we going to eat tonight? It's sort of, so the scope of some people's lives was for many of us very skewed, but it
Right.
was a time, to kind of soul search. And I wasn't feeling super confident about staying in the arts. I just thought this is maybe not the time. And although I had professed that I would never go back to education, and I had put all my Latin books out on the curb in Manhattan, I remember that fateful day. I came back by this time I was living in Upper Manhattan, and told my roommate, I said, you know what, I need to go. I think I'm going to go back to education. I need something a little bit more solid. And he dropped the New York Times education page on my, in my room. And I woke up and I said, okay, let me read this. And there was, I don't know, oddly enough, a Latin teacher position on the Upper West Side, walking distance from my apartment.
Wow.
And I thought, well, let's apply.
Mhm.
And it was perfect timing. I got the job, um, the Trinity School in Manhattan, and it was the first time I was not the only Latin teacher in the building. The Trinity School was K to 12. We had 2 middle school Latin teachers, and I think it was 4 or 5 in the upper school, and they taught Greek and Latin and all this stuff. And it was phenomenal to have colleagues. I'd never had someone I could go talk to. Observing their classes, I was like, I couldn't believe what was possible in the classroom with Latin because I'd never seen it.
Right.
And it changed forever my approach to teaching Latin. I had no idea.
Right.
And so, yeah, I was there for a couple of years, and um, I, my middle school head at the time was this great woman. Um, and she came to me my first year, and she said, Marcus, you seem really calm when things go, when it hits the fan. I think she said something hits the fan. Would you like to be a grade level dean? And I said, oh, okay. What does that entail? And so the following year, I was the dean of the sixth grade, which meant that I supported, the other sixth grade teachers in terms of parent-teacher conferences, and they need something, and coordinating the team. Oh, we needed to change the schedule, and work with the other deans to talk about what that looks like. So I had, again, sort of pulled into leadership again.
Yeah, I was
I
going
didn't
to say
ask
that
for
wasn't your first
it.
taste,
What's
right?
that?
That wasn't your first taste in leadership because you
No, it
had.
wasn't my first taste, and but it was just interesting to have not auditioned for it, but got the part in some ways, like,
Yeah,
and again, looking back, I do as much as possible try to stay calm when things aren't going well. And I think, sort of back to my parents, my dad is a minister and community caregiver, my mom, who was a psychiatric nurse. Um, Service was kind of always just around and caring for others. And I think being the youngest of four, where in
right.
some ways I wasn't invited to the big kid games, there's a lot of observing of systems and people and how they interacted. And so I think that just kind of carried over. And so it was great being able to be there for the students and teachers, as a sixth grade dean. I think that was a level again. And there's always tricky situations and angry parents and different things like that. But definitely, again, learned a lot, and but also encouraged to make sure that I was moving in the right direction. I had that woman who hired me in that position subsequently left. And I'll be so kind as just to say that her replacement encouraged me to find greener pastures. I think that, but I think it's important. I think people can fall in love with jobs, and sometimes they just won't work. You can't will them to work if you're in an environment where the values don't align, or there's something structurally that doesn't work, or whatever. And so I actually ended up following the woman who hired me to the new school that she took on in Rye, New York. And by that time had met my future wife. And so, there are more questions about life as they pose, as you start thinking about entering that type of partnership. And so, I realized that I didn't have a master's degree at that point, and I was pretty excited to be back in education. And I often talk, when I've talked about this transition, sort of being in education, leaving education, and going back to education, it reminded me a little bit of the students that I met in undergrad who came in as first year students, having been in the ROTC. So these 21-year-old freshmen were not 18-year-old freshmen. They came in with a purpose. They came in, more mature, driven. And I think my second time around in education, I was just a bit more clear about what it is I wanted to do, what impact I wanted to make. And so didn't have a master's, and was talking to someone, I can't remember who it was, but I was trying to decide whether to, because I was being offered a dean role at that current school in Rye. And I thought, oh, more leadership. And they said, well, you've been a leader in schools. And they said, but you don't have a master's degree. You're probably going to start a family. I would go get the master's degree. So I said, great. And my wife, who's from the West Coast, born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and had been on the East Coast as a sign language interpreter at Rochester Institute of Technology. Didn't love the East Coast at the time, and kind of said, I think I need to get back to the West Coast in 3 years. And so I wouldn't call it a threat, but it was something that I took seriously. And so I, applied for grad school, was able, blessed, it was great. I got into Columbia and into Harvard, and she was done with New York. She was there with me for a year or so. And so I thought, okay. And then sort of joking about how I picked my Latin major. Massachusetts has Pete's Coffee. And so I thought, okay, let's get back to Pete's Coffee, which is a California, a Berkeley brand. And
Yeah.
so, I joke, but obviously it was a great opportunity to be able to go to Harvard and in their school leadership program, and learn a lot. I think, hopefully never appear to bite the hand that feeds you, but there are some interesting politics at Harvard that not that I wasn't expecting politics, but it's not what I thought. It wasn't something in my forethought. And so
Right.
the tensions between public and private purpose, the tensions of what is the storytelling you need to get resources, and I just learned a lot there, and maybe not everything that was on the curriculum and syllabi. So It was, it was only a year program. There's a lot of programs in education that are only a year because they recognize that people in education they're not going to get paid so much on the outside. So how much time can they really take away from earning a full income? So anyway, as far as starting a family, as my cousin talks about, there's a difference between plans and execution. We were hoping to have our child after graduation, but I do have pictures of me holding my daughter as I got my diploma from Harvard. She was about 2 months old when I graduated from there.
So you graduated, and then what? A new world opened up for
Yeah.
you because
Yeah.
you had that degree.
Knowing that, the child was on the way and I was graduating, I thought, okay, and my wife Laurel wanted to move back to the East Coast, and I wasn't against, or West Coast, and I certainly wasn't against it. I have, my brother was still out there, and her family was there. I thought, well, I should. I'd work with some search. No, what did I do? Oh yeah, I'd reach out to some search consultants, and we were in conversation, and I was looking at job boards, and so I reached out to the consultant. I said, "Hey, I'm coming out in February because I think there's like a February break, or maybe it's January. And anyone who wants me can get me for free. No one needs to fly me out. I'm going to be there." Because I'd set up some of my own, some of the charter school networks and public schools who don't necessarily have the same resources to use consultants. I'd made some of my own connections through some of my classmates and then just independently. But I said, hey, I'm going to be out for a week, or maybe it was 10 days. They want me, I'm there. And I got two really good nibbles from that. There's two boys' schools in San Francisco that were looking for a middle school head, which seemed like the next thing sort of in the process in terms of leadership. And it was that was an interesting process because one of the schools certainly appealed to me, quite honestly, visually. It was a gorgeous, beautiful, more modern school, lots of bright, light. Even in San Francisco, like they were in the sunset, so they got some sunshine, but it's just beautiful. And fairly traditional, I'd say, in terms of its schooling. And then there's the school that I ended up going to, Cathedral School for Boys, that quite frankly was dark. I mean, it was part of Grace Cathedral, not a lot of natural light. And, you had to literally go through what's called the crypt to get to the gym. I mean, just some of the pieces there. Although my father, was a minister, I don't consider myself a Christian, and I mostly had been studying Buddhism since like '89 and practicing. But I remember coming back. I had a morning interview with them, with I think with the other boys' school, afternoon with Cathedral School, and was walking down the hill, kind of beaming. Right, I had these two, I thought, pretty good interviews, and I can't remember who I called. I was talking to someone, and the way they put it was, they said, "Okay, well, if you have a son, which school would you want them to go to?" And that, I mean, I didn't have to think about it. It's a cathedral school. And it's your own values, right? There's the other school is a wonderful school. But in terms of what I thought in terms of community, at the cathedral school at that time, I felt like you could be any kind of boy you wanted to, right? It wasn't any kind of stereotype of a boy, whether yes, you could play sports, but you could also be in San Francisco Ballet, and you could, it was just great, and really valued music, and how music is the most difficult team sport there is. In basketball or soccer, I can sub you out. John, if you're not playing well, I'm going to put you on the bench. I can't tell you to stop playing trumpet. I can't like you have to really commit as a team member in music. And so I was there for 7 years, and I remember someone telling me, it'll take 3 years to learn your school and 7 years to be able to tell a story, right? To really have had an impact. And although I'm often sort of skeptical of sage wisdom and all these aphorisms, it actually kind of turned out to be true. I think in 3 years, I kind of understood our place in the marketplace, what we're all about, our curriculum. And by year 7, was able to make, some fairly impactful pieces in the curriculum, bringing a lot more project-based learning where the kids were exploring first and sort of doing those things. And then the math curriculum, which wasn't my brilliant idea, it was my math teacher said, we don't like our math curriculum. We think it could be better for the boys. What do you think about this? I'm like, I think it's great if you think it's great. I mean, I'm not, you're the expert. You're the content expert. I will support you. Explain it to me. What do I need to tell the parents? Let's go do this. And I think, and which leads me, what will be the next phase. I had this teacher who's a humanities teacher, Michael Wittmeyer, who, unassuming guy, taught 5th and 6th grade history, and had this project he called Project X. I said, what's that? He says, well, and I think it was with the 6th grade boys, because 5th grade, I think they had sort of more of a set curriculum, but he, on top of everything else in his curriculum, he had this thing called Project X, where he invited the boys, I think he gave them 2,000 years of history. And he said, pick anything in this 2,000 year span, learn about it, and then pick any modality you want for showing us what you learned. You can write a paper, you can do a movie, you can write a song, you can write a comic book, models, don't care. And I was just fascinated. I was like, wow, and he says, well, some of my colleagues, quite honestly, are skeptical of this. And he goes, and I'll tell you, this will be the best work I get from these kids all year long. I thought, this is fascinating. So you by doing this, now, yeah, you can't choose something outside of history, but you've given them a fair 2,000 years of history. Just about anyone can find something interesting. And then you said you can do whatever you want, meaning any natural passion that they already had, or something that they wanted to try that they had never tried,
Right.
was wide open. And
Right.
so these kids, they did write songs, they did write, comic books, and some wrote traditional papers. But the one story that really still touches me, we had a student who let's just say had a really rough childhood growing up. And when teachers say, or adults say, certainly teachers, this kid does nothing in my class, the hyperbolic, they do nothing. This kid actually did do nothing. He would literally sit in class and smile. It was certainly pleasant, but he just produced no work. I mean, literally no work, class after class. And I thought, wow, I don't know. But with this assignment, this kid created a stop motion animation using, I think he used Legos and clay, that was, I can't remember exactly the topic, but was historically accurate. He did this great voiceover. I mean, it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. And it really just left a mark of, and I sometimes, I hopefully doesn't hurt my educator friends' feelings, as if there's anything I learned in all my time in education is that school is bad for children. So education is good for children, but I don't know that how we put them in these sort of rooms and boxes and squares and set
Right.
curriculum. And I remember when I started blogging at that, not too long after that, one of my sort of quotable quotes was, if you've already written the curriculum before the student enters the room, if you've already written the curriculum before the student enters the room, you really can't call it student-centered. To me, student-centered is, we've sat down with John, we met with John, we talked to John. John, what are you interested in? Then we're going to write the curriculum based on what we know about John. And it's really the best of special education, right? It's not assuming, it's not worrying about the curriculum. It's worrying about the learner first. Let's get to know this guy before we start figuring out what he may or may not need to learn and how he may need to learn it. So, yeah.
There's so many parallels between your experience in education and the workplace today, and how we can make a workplace that is that gives the organization what it needs, the customer's needs, and taking into consideration the employee in the same way that you took into consideration the student's needs. And I just think you're bringing so much to the table now.
Yeah, and I think, and we talked about this in some of our conversations, in a school, just like any other business, you have 3 really key constituencies that there's always attention. You have the student, who's the ultimate customer, right? You're trying to provide this, but you have the parent who's sending your child to your school, and certainly in a private school is paying hefty tuition. And then, well, maybe there's 4 constituencies. You have the employee base, right? And they have their needs. And then you have a board.
Right.
So you have 4 very distinct groups who, certainly we experienced this during COVID. A benefit or something that was positive for the teachers was always almost automatically negative for the families at home, and vice versa. If you gave something, conceded something to the parents, not conceded like you were giving, but like, we think this will help families at home. There's a
Right.
price to pay for the teachers to do something differently to deliver that experience, so it was giving relief at home, and vice versa. If I try to create something that was more humane for the teachers during that extremely stressful time, the
Right.
parents were up in arms going, well, now we have to do this because the teachers won't do that. And so, it's but to your point, in leadership, and sort of jumping ahead, but during COVID, when I was at this point ahead of school, one thing that's true, and maybe is overused in places that have a lot of resources can clearly cure a lot. If you're a startup, you can't just throw money at things. You can't throw money at the solution. You don't have the money.
Right.
And there's no such thing as a sure thing. So going into debt isn't something that I would recommend for people. And I've seen that happen where people have made big bets on things and built new buildings with the promise of new students and never got them and closed. And
Right.
so I think if having the resources, and I was in a school where in my time we were able to triple the endowment, which is always helpful, where you're not relying just on tuition day to day to work. But we did have the resources and luckily had a campus that was 13 acres. And so we purchased military grade tents, and we had school outside during COVID. And so and it was amazing how the teachers embraced that for many reasons. One, it showed that we cared for them, that we thought, okay, we're not just going to throw you back in the building. But it also, because educators are some of the most creative people on the planet, they were just so excited.
Yeah.
They either they realized, wow, I realized we always had hawks on campus, but now it's part of our classroom.
Right.
And now we got to go find out what that hawk just did and figure about, talk about the mice on campus and talk about the rabbits and talk about all these different things, right? And so, novel problem solving is such an important part of leadership and in business, obviously, because as much as there's books and articles and all that, they only apply so much as you can implement them in your organization.
Now, if I understand correctly, 7 years have gone by and you're about to make another change.
Yeah.
What happened?
So after 7 years, Cathedral School for Boys, I don't know that I get bored so much, but I do love a challenge. I like challenging myself. And I do think that in that time, I started to realize, I love that the students are learning, but I think what I loved more was creating an environment so that could happen, right? Creating an environment where the employees felt cared for and understood. And cared for doesn't mean that you don't fire people, right? You still have to do your job, but you can still do that in a way that's caring.
Right.
But then, so there's that. And also how to create an environment for the parents where they can understand and they can feel heard. And perhaps not a secret, but 98% of the conversations that you have with parents who, whether they're upset or not, is just being heard. Because you can't always fix the things that they're upset about anyway. Well, I'm really upset that you don't have this anymore. Like, well, I'm sorry, we don't have that. But once you've listened and you've sincerely listened and you hear them, and they're fine. They're out of your office and that's it. And so I started thinking about becoming head of school, and to be fair, also in terms of my strengths, I can be as organized as anyone, but it's not my joy. The triage of being a middle school head and assistant head of school was not, it was something I could do and actually kind of missed a lot of it. Certainly when I became head of school, you're further away from the students. But what I was keenly interested in is how do you create an environment, a humane setting to do your work? Because in so many systems, and if you have more questions about film, I can certainly fill you up. We've created these inhumane environments to be successful,
Right.
and it's counterintuitive. and the mythology of the Iron Fist boss. And I know they exist, and maybe those companies are financially successful, but I can hardly imagine that they're successful in a holistic way, where their employees enjoy being there, or their employees have a rich life and they can go home and have a rich life at home, and it's not the no one's paying the price, if you will. And so I started looking at head of school jobs. But what had changed in my sort of early days of looking for a job, I think when I was first looking for a Latin teaching position, I didn't care how crazy or not crazy the administration was, or how crazy or not crazy the board was. I was going to be in my little silo teaching Latin and pretty much buffered from that. But as head of school, that's it. You're in the middle of it all. And so board was important. The philosophy of the school was important. By then, I really was not excited about standards-based learning where everything's the same, where you and I are expected to learn the same thing on the same day at the same rate. Was counterintuitive for me for what I became had by that time evolved to understand about education and how we learn. And so there's this little funky school called the Logan School, and it was another one of those where I didn't reach out. I was working with a search consultant, and was a finalist for 2 years running while I was still at the Cathedral School. One of the schools, I'm glad I didn't get the job. And they didn't hire me, so I think it was definitely not a match. The other one, I don't know. I think it worked out for the best, but it was one that I thought was one I could have really enjoyed. It was in Seattle, but I was working with the same search consultant called me out of the blue. I think it was January, something maybe about January in my life, but which is not the normal cycle. The head of school cycle typically is accept resumes probably starting in the summer, start to see candidates in the fall, name your new head of school, typically, by winter break, so people can go off on their holiday and not be freaked out. You might come in the spring for a campus visit, and then you start your new job in July of that year. And so this person, they were calling in in January, which was way out of cycle. And they said, I'll never forget, this consultant I'd work with, love this guy. He said, Marcus, I found a school that I would hate and you would love. I thought, okay, tell me more. And because he really got to know me, he got to know me as a leader and as an educator, and that
That's
I
great.
love constructivist learning. I love when learning came from some organic space or an experience and not out of a book. And
Right.
books, believe me, are wonderful. I love books. But in terms of how students learn. And so he explained to me this little school where 250 kids or 200 something kids, where the curriculum was written for each child. I said, what does that mean? And so every child from, the youngest age of kindergartners up through our 8th grade 14-year-olds would pick a topic. Could be comic books is one of their loves. And the teacher would help write a curriculum around that. So the kid who might be studying comic books could learn about the art of it, could also learn about the business of comic books, could learn about the origin stories and mythology, and where does, what came before comic books. And so you could do this 360 education, the math of comic books, how, what would be the force that the Hulk would have to actually punch to break through that wall, right? How tough would his skin need to be to not be, there's no end to the learning you could do. You could look at cultural studies. I mean, but the key, of course, is the kid already loves comic books. So this was a school where you had to kick kids out to go to recess. Like, you got to, John, you have to stop working on your plane. You got to go out and get some vitamin D. You got to run and get some sun and some air.
Right.
And then you can come back and work. So I, was really excited and went for the interview. To be honest, their website was not impressive. When I went to log in, I was like, okay, this is a little rough around the edges, but let me go see what's going on. And just I was there for the interview, and I wasn't able to see class in session because I think I don't know why. I think it was maybe over one of their breaks, but had met with all these people all day, and I had this sort of long break between my last interview and my interview with the board. And I was like, okay, I was exhausted because I didn't really sleep the night before. I was just so excited. And it was a 2-day, it was a 2-day thing where you had a parent meeting on each day where you met with them and they threw all their questions at you. And you had to look smart and have good answers. and said, okay, you have about an hour and a half, do something. I can't just sit there. So I decided, let me walk around to every classroom. And I walked around every classroom and I kind of took notes. And I just, because the walls can speak, right? You can see the students' work and you can see what's going on. And when I sat down, with the board, they in the search chairs there, they said, so what do you think? And I said, well, if you would allow me, I just want to kind of look at my notes here. And I said, everything's created here, right? You can see the kids' work created. And I ended up having this great conversation with the board and all their questions. And one of the board members was a jazz aficionado and also a jazz musician. And he had all these great questions. And I was like, I was just thinking in my head, I was like, you probably should ask me about my expertise as well, not just talk about jazz, but I was happy to answer those questions. But at the end, the board chair at the time was walking me back to my car, and he said, in that conversation, I'm not trying to denigrate anyone, but you talked more articulately about the school in the 2 days that you've been here than our current head. That it was a mismatch. It was a alignment mismatch, and so that felt good. Like he goes, I think you really got us, and so I think that John and I, you and I also often talk about in terms of the work that we do. It's like we have to be the best listeners in the room, and so I think that day I was probably the best listener that I could be, and got the job, right. And so I was there for, I want to say 8 years. And again, 3 years to kind of learn your school, and 7 or 8 years, I definitely had stories to tell, and some of the impact that I felt like I was able to make with the team there in the community. Well, it was an amazing experience. So yeah.
What have I not asked you today about your background that you think is important?
I think, I don't know how you would have asked this question, but I've used the word humane before in this conversation, and I think as I get older and I watch my own child see the world as a 17-year-old starting to look at college, and
Right.
My wife who sees the world through a different experience in childbirth, and all my experiences, I feel like we can be kinder. And it's not difficult, but in concept, obviously, I don't think anyone goes out trying to be mean.
Right.
But what happens? Why does that happen? And so when I think about leadership, and I think about what I want to hold on to, and hopefully held throughout my life, is how to be humane, how to be kind,
Right.
Because I don't think anyone's, again, if we look at a business, I don't think anyone's employee is coming to work trying to sabotage the day. There's yes, maybe 0.2% if they really want to take you down, but they're trying to make a living. They want to have an impact. They want to be seen, and I think that there's definitely times in my life where that message came so clear, and it, again, came from good listening. And sitting when I was doing a practicum, I think they called it, in grad school, and I was visiting with, again, the wisdom of sixth graders. There's a group of sixth graders who were talking with their teacher and what they call an advisory, which is sort of more the social emotional time for the students. And the question the teacher asked was, what does it feel like when someone else in the class comments on something you just said, right? So if you're in class and you say, oh, well, this is what I think about Shakespeare's writing or whatever it is, and a classmate has something to say about it, everyone had things to say, like, oh, it's nice because I heard they're listening or something. And I remember this one kid says, little boy, he said, it lets me know that someone knows I'm alive. I thought, wow. So that alone, is huge. And I'm reminded of it, every time I go out, and I always say hi to the grocer, hey, how's it going today? What is it like working here? How you feeling? And I remember asking one person, I was having lunch with someone and before I moved from Denver, she's this brilliant leader. And we just met at some Mediterranean, sort of like a Chipotle, I can't remember what it's called in Denver, but where you go through the assembly, you tell the server what you want. And I remember asking someone, I say, so how's your day? She's like, not great. She goes, does it show? I said, no, it didn't show. I just thought I'd ask. And, it was a very brief interaction, but I just said, well, hang in there, we all have them. But I mean, what is that gift, hopefully that we can give each other of being kind and sure, in a business, there's a bottom line.
Right.
Business is reflected in its profits. And I don't think the best way to get to profits is through haranguing people.
Mm.
If you can, and you see this all the time in business, I feel like I've been able to get the best out of my teams when I was the best listener and when I was able to use whatever I learned and turn it into creating an environment where everyone could then thrive. Um, and and that's what pays. And that's, when I came into, one of the schools we had pretty low admissions. We were really struggling with admissions. And so, listened, and I listened to the admissions director who had been there for years and was brilliant, and realized that we weren't telling our story very well. We had conflicting things that we were telling people. And then we were apologizing for some of the things that were actually hallmarks of our program. Like, why are you apologizing that we don't have testing? We don't believe in testing. We proudly do not have this. And then on a sort of whim, not a whim, but we finally, I was staffing up and we had a communications director who's still there, who's also brilliant. And I did these pro bono talks in the community because we were a school that served a gifted population, which is a very misunderstood population, like a lot of populations of children or children in general. But I would go to a local community center, and one time at someone's home that hosted, and I said, here's what gifted is. And I spent 98% of the talk just talking about cognition, how students learn, and only about 2%. And I said, and by the way, I happen to work here. And I got at least one parent and one child admitted to our school for every one of those. And that's one student, or that's one night that I spent 90 minutes of my time to bring in $25,000 a year to an institution. So, you just look at these opportunities and you listen, right? You listen and then try to implement what you learned into it to help that organization be successful.
I feel like such a lucky guy to be able to meet people like you and to get to know you, and to, you and I share so many values that it's just been a pure joy getting to know you and working with you, Markus. I'm so grateful that we as an organization have you to help us grow. And I just think the future is going to be so exciting. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but you exude creativity. You are a leader that but the foundation of who you are is you get this formal education in education and these experiences of leadership, and you just like the bass behind you in jazz. You're going to listen to the music that's being played, and you're going to contribute to that music in a fashion that you don't yet today know what that is. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just like to say, I mean, I appreciate the kind words, but you talk about alignment, right? So when you reached out to me and you're like, hey, I didn't know you. I'm John from Focus Cloud. I saw your
Yeah.
profile. Let's
Right.
chat. And I looked at what you're doing. I thought this is really interesting. And I certainly was trying to decide what to do after I left that last job, the last head of school job. I'm like, okay, here's some things I could do.
Mhm.
And I was very much cautioned or supported by some people that are just lifelong friends. They said, we've seen this 1,000 times. They're leaders in tech space. And they said, don't jump into anything too soon. And of course I did. I jumped into this and I jumped into that. But, when you reached out and I saw what you're doing, again, that theme of humanity came through. And when you invited me to
Right.
observe a first chief executive session, peer advisory, a focus group, and the structure of it, right? And you talk about jazz. Jazz has a structure. People may say, "Oh, it's anything goes,"
Right.
Absolutely not. There's
Right.
a real structure there,
Yes.
at least in music that I would consider jazz or consider music. But anyway, but within that, there's an improvisation, and what that structure does is it creates safety. So
Mm.
for these executives who, of course, we don't talk about them as individuals, but like who have very challenging some of them very challenging situations in their businesses. How do you create that environment where they're sharing freely, so that, because when they can share freely, they can get solutions, they can get the feedback from their peers who have these amazing insights from all over. I mean, they had, and talk about that group, the group that was, you know, got a chance to hang out with, such different people,
Right.
such different business paths, business models. Of course, they're not, they don't compete in these groups. They come from different industry. But you who, you know, again, serial entrepreneur with tons of experience, you don't say that much. You really don't. You don't. You're not we just, you know, the sage on the stage. You're not, you know, I'm going to fill you all with wisdom.
Right.
It's no, I'm going to facilitate a space where you're going to be able to present your challenges in a safe environment, which you can't do with your board, which you
Right.
can't do with your customers, that you can't do with your other employees, or even other you know, middle or senior leadership. And you're going to, again, get this place where you can test your ideas, and you're going to be held accountable, because you don't get to bring a challenge and say, oh, I have this really big challenge with my whatever.
Right.
And then come back 3 sessions later and not have someone say, oh, by the way, John, we need an update. You need to have done something about that,
Right.
to move your organization and to move your leadership forward. So, you know, and we talk about in our work vision, right? So I think our vision's aligned enough for us to
Yeah.
come together and to think about how we can serve leaders.
Right.
And we all know leadership, I mean, it's a cliche, but leadership can be pretty lonely. And getting people, creating in different environments for people to grow their leadership. And there's nothing wrong with grabbing a beer with a leader, but it's very different than a little bit more of a structured, business-minded environment and offering where they can just keep growing, not just in their own practice
Right.
because of what they bring, but just gleaning from other people. And then you bring these great speakers in, who also bring their expertise. It's such a great learning community. Again, back to education. It's just really at the heart of it. It's a learning community, learning about leadership, learning about themselves, and you know, and hopefully being able to sustain, maintain, and thrive in the businesses that they're running.
We're lucky to be growing with you, Markus.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll continue the conversation.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it.
Thanks.
Thank you.